And making up our trio, the former Army Major Campbell Newman, who never wanted to follow his family into politics, but somehow ended up being the Mayor of Brisbane, then Premier of Queensland. Today he runs a very successful capital investment company and is a go-to political commentator.
I want to thank all Queenslanders this evening for voting for change. We will keep our promises and we will not let you down.
Now, if both your parents were cabinet ministers in the federal government, it would seem reasonable, almost a given, that you two would follow down a similar political path. But not Campbell Newman. He spent 12 years in the army, became a major and worked in engineering for a decade, privately building his career. But a sliding doors moment derailed all of that. Campbell seized control of Brisbane City Hall and then the premiership of the state of Queensland. His rise, though, was almost as sudden as his fall, but thankfully he still gets to speak his mind, especially on places like here at Sky News. Campbell Newman, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Chris.
Now, Kevin, your father, and Jocelyn, your mother, both ministers. Kevin, a minister in the Fraser government, and Jocelyn, a minister in the Howard government. It was DNA inevitability that you would get into politics, but you didn't go that route.
No, I certainly wasn't going to go into politics and never set out to have a political career, although I'm conscious that when I say that, people are thinking, well, that's a load of rubbish, but that is actually the case. So I was very much intent on following my father's footsteps in being in the army, although I was in the army engineers and he was in the infantry. And then I had a business career, which I greatly enjoyed, and I'm back in business now.
You wanted to be in infantry, but of course in an engineering base. You wanted to be in the front line. You wanted to be in a war zone, didn't you?
Well, in the army, the engineer corps actually out in front with the infantry, and sadly I reflect that members of my corps, the Royal Australian Engineers, were actually killed in some terrible incidents in Afghanistan, clearing improvised explosive devices out in front of the infantry when the troops were advancing along certain road corridors and the like. So that's the sort of thing that combat engineers do in the army. So that's why I picked that particular corps that I wanted to go. But I also did civil engineering along the way.
12 years in the army, what does it do to a man?
A sense of discipline, a sense of purpose. I think the right sort of values in terms of personal values about integrity and honour, and that's stood me in good stead through my business career. Frankly, in a political career, it was a vulnerability because I think my opponents often had the view that if we could chip away at his people's sense of, whether he's a truthful character, his integrity, that's going to see him bite. And on occasions, I certainly did.
Why was that? Was that from your days in the army, or purely because Campbell Newman is Campbell Newman?
I think it's more from my days in the army, but also my upbringing with my parents. I mean, for me, integrity is all, and people's view of you is critically important. And, politics is a tough game, and frankly, it gets tougher and tougher in this country all the time. And to go after a candidate or a political figure and attack their integrity, their honesty, etc., that's just par for the course these days in Australia. And frankly, in the media, may I say we in the media, tend to get involved in that an awful lot, perhaps more than we should, without proper evidence.
Tell us about the sliding doors moment. Was it the time that you lost your dad?
Well, what happened was I lost my dad in 1999, and he died at a pretty young age. He'd been in Vietnam, and I've always put it down to his exposure to Agent Orange, but he got a very rare disease called lupus. So he died at the age of 65, and I was sitting in the funeral service in Canberra, and I thought about my dad's life and what he'd done. It was a life of service. He'd been in the army, then been in the federal parliament, and then after parliament he'd served the community in northern Tasmania. I thought, well, what am I doing? I've got a great business career, I'm looking after my family, but I'm not putting back into my community. So a few years later, when I heard that the Liberal Party were looking for a candidate for the Lord Mayoralty, being of a view that the Eden Labor administration, headed by Jim Sawley, weren't doing enough in terms of the infrastructure needs of the city, I thought, well, here's how I can serve, and I put my hand up.
Yeah, and you virtually stormed into those roles. You stormed into City Hall, you stormed into the leadership of the opposition and then Premier of Queensland. You weren't mucking around, and there's a little bit of your experience in the army getting things done in the way that you started your political career. Would you agree?
Oh, very much so. I mean, I'm about outcomes and not about the politics. That was always my thing. I learnt to, frankly, get into the profession of politics and play a fairly good political game, if I can put it that way. But for me, ultimately, if it had to be done, it was done, and it had to be approached in that way. And sadly, if my biggest criticism, and I often am saying this on this network, is that more and more the politicians we're seeing across the political spectrum in this country, at the three levels of government, are about the position and the game of politics rather than actually getting stuff done. And it really makes me cranky.
Yeah, I don't know whether they copy from their public servants or the public servants are too much of an influence on the politicians, but you're right. Especially at this time in our history, after a pandemic, after enormous grief through bushfires, there's never been a more appropriate time to get things done. And I still get a feeling that we're slow on the uptake, Campbell.
Oh, we're very slow on the uptake, and it doesn't matter what level of government you look at the moment, they're not working hard enough. They're not, for example, in local governments across the nation, realising this is a serious issue, and their responsibility is to get things through their planning systems as quickly as possible. Good projects that will employ tradies, that will employ consultants, that will actually see money come into the coffers of local government, provide great homes for people or office buildings or new retail premises. They're being held up, and they shouldn't be held up at a time like this. You turn to the state level, red tape and bureaucracy impacts on every small and medium-sized business. Larger businesses have the capacity to deal with red tape far more easily, and indeed red tape often stops decent competition and better outcomes for consumers. Yep. And then you go to the federal level and, they're my crowd. They've got to do a better job. I mean, they said they were going to build dams and irrigation schemes. I haven't seen any yet. I've seen consultancies, I've seen studies, but I actually haven't seen the work being done. And so it is. I mean, I got elected as Lord Mayor in in March 2004, Chris, and I left basically 7 years later. And by the time I'd left, we'd built one tunnel, 2 bridges, had commenced work on another tunnel, which is now known as Legacy Way, and also got the state government to come on board and build a thing called Airport Link, which was finished only a year or two later. So that's what was done in 7 years. But, you see these administrations down this country there year after year after year. I mean, I've got to make a pointed comment here about the Palaszczuk government. They've almost been in office for 6 years now, and what infrastructure track record can they point to? The things that have actually been finished.
No, not much.
But so it is across the nation, across the political spectrum. I stress I'm throwing this criticism at all politicians, all political parties, and the 3 levels of government.
I think that's entirely fair, and we're frustrated. As voters, we're frustrated with all of that. I want to talk about your popularity. Let's remind the viewers that your popularity, your slide into the premiership was extraordinary. Remind us of the numbers. You annihilated Labor.
We had a very good result in 2012. Supposedly, one of the biggest election wins ever in Australian history. The Labor Party, I can't remember how many seats actually had in an 89-seat parliament. In the end, that number escapes me.
It was 77.
There was 7 Labor were left. Yeah, there were 7 Labor MPs left, and a smattering of independents and minor party representatives. So it was a big win. And it was off the back of a very long and difficult campaign, essentially an election campaign that went from around about April 2011 till March 2012.
And then you got into power and you started to do things that others in other parts of Australia were cheering you on about. You were deciding to come and attack bikies, and you were certainly attacking pedophiles, and you really made it one of your two key missions, your key policies. And then all of a sudden there was a little bit of pushback from those in the underground, and we remember that ghostly video that was circulated around. Let's remind our viewers of that.
We are Anonymous Australia, and today we would like to speak to you about Campbell Newman's push for the new anti-bikie laws. We are Anonymous, we are Legion, we do not forgive, we do not forget. Campbell Newman, expect us.
Did you remember seeing that for the first time? What was it like?
Oh, it was pretty creepy and awful, but, you know, I'm made of fairly stern stuff. You worry more about your family when you see things like that. But isn't it interesting, Chris, in the middle of this global pandemic? So we've seen this, you know, we've seen 8 or 9 months of this now, where we've seen Australians' liberties taken away from them, their ability to move freely, to live out their lives. And we've seen none of that nonsense, really. But when I went after actually a group of criminals, various criminal gangs, we had all sorts of people from the left rallying to their cause.
Yeah.
Even our national broadcaster, the ABC, seemed to portray in their coverage that this was like an argument between the government, those terrible people with that terrible Newman bloke, going after these sort of freedom-loving motorcyclists who just love riding their motorbikes, and they were just great people, and it was a dispute almost. It's just, you know, like a political story, whereas it was a government doing the right thing. And as a result, Chris, in the period that we did this, and for some time after, indeed, the government lost office, crime was down in Queensland something like 15 to 20% on most of the very serious sort of offences, assaults and robberies, etc.
And surely that's what the outcome, you're outcome driven, and you got the outcome that was required. But behind the scenes, let's not underplay this. There were threats on your life. There were additional security given to you 24/7. Describe what was going on behind the scenes.
Well, there were threats. There were threats against me. There were threats against my wife and my daughters. We had 24/7 security for I think at least a year, as I recall, and on occasions, you know, my kids and also my wife had to be escorted everywhere by, you know, police protection officers as well, because of some very pointed threats. Again, and I've really got to make the point that that sort of was accepted by many in the media as well. You know, almost he deserves it. And got scant coverage, and I compare that again today with the coverage we're seeing of left-wing politicians during this crisis. It's somehow, you know, the headlines are screaming that they've been threatened, and nobody should be threatened in public office. But the media should do a better job of not playing favourites or taking sides when critical issues are being dealt with by government.
OK, let's roll forward 8 years from that time to today. We've got a Queensland Labor government that keeps the borders closed because they say their job is primarily to keep people healthy, and jobs will come at a later stage. How they've worked that out, I've got no idea. You've got a recalcitrant chief health officer who says that even people from the ACT can't get into Queensland because they're in the middle of New South Wales. Work that out. And then you've got this corruption shadow that's followed that cabinet terribly in the last 4 years, and yet the polls are telling us that Anastasia Palaszczuk is still in front. Please explain.
Look, I think firstly the big thing is that the LNP have not made the case for change over the last 3 years since the last election. They just haven't taken the fight to Labor strongly enough. And one of the big problems is their leader, Deb Frecklington, isn't well known enough by Queenslanders. She's announced some great policies in recent weeks, the upgrade of the Bruce Highway. She has a great policy platform of the new Bradfield scheme, which is about taking the waters of the rivers that flow to the Coral Sea and turning them inland. And that is a great project to build this state. But it's just, they're just running out of time. That's the problem. And if we turn to the government, you know, the things you've just said, they are there. They are stark. I've been a strong advocate for the LNP to go after the inconsistencies, the lack of logic, the lack of process, the lack of transparency about some of the calls that have been made. I mean, we've got a federal federal deputy chief health officer who's actually trained in the field versus Dr. Young, who is a medical administrator.
Correct.
Now, the federal officer is saying there is no reason for this to be done, and yet we follow Dr. Young's advice and we're told it's the science. Well, who picked the 1st of November? That was the date that was being bandied around in the last week as the date that the borders would be open with New South Wales. What was the science in that? Could it be that the election is on the 31st of the month? I mean, you know, where is the science in some of these things? It's not there. These are quasi-political calls that are being made.
OK, let's look at the federal budget. We've got a federal government acting almost like a Labor government here. I think there were aspects of the stimulus, like the doubling of JobSeeker, that went way over the top and caused a lot of people not to seek work at a time when we had 1 million unemployed. And I think there are aspects of the budget that go over the top. It's hard to determine the difference between left and right at the federal level right now.
Chris, that's, I'm afraid, my sense of it as well, unfortunately. And I'll make this point that you cannot outspend Labor. And yet I watched the Federal Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, hand all this down the other night, and you know, what do we see now? We're seeing you know, Labor, of course, saying it's not good enough. Women got nothing, which is complete BS, of course. But you cannot outspend Labor. If we're going to repair this country, this is what we need to do. And these things are harder to do than just spend our money, apparently. The first one is we need to lower the cost of energy, electricity and gas, and we need to actually get it down to benchmarks with, say, places like Texas in the United States. Secondly, we need IR reform so that it is more straightforward and easy to employ people and pay people and get away from all this stuff about accusations of wage theft. Thirdly, we need less red tape and bureaucracy when you're running your business. And fourthly, we need to actually accelerate approvals, get them through far more quickly. And that's what I spoke about before with you. We need to actually unleash business. If we do those things that I've just said, business will do the rest. We don't necessarily need the extent of government spending or stimulus. We need to actually get out of the way of business and let people go and build their dream and employ people. And that is missing from all the discussion from, again, all sides of politics. They just won't deal with the critical issues.
Yeah, to give people money is one thing. To say, here, we're going to give you money so you can employ more people, that's well and good. But unless that business is given some kind of incentive to produce more than they normally would, it is a waste of time. The cliff will be delayed, but the cliff will come at one stage. And one quick thing, the Institute of Public Affairs is now saying, based on what we've heard from the federal budget, we won't pay off the debt, the $1 trillion debt, for 60 years, 2080. There are very, very young people around today who will be dead before that.
Chris, once upon a time, particularly, say, in World War II, we could borrow for the war effort for reasons of national survival, and then we went into a period in the 50s and 60s with long periods of uninterrupted economic growth. I mean, there was a credit squeeze or two in there and there was some recessions, but it was a boom period for this country. Now, can anyone in the federal treasury or in the federal government, any of the politicians, put their hand on their heart and say that's what's going to happen out of this? We're not going to see that unless we have a national vision to actually supercharge the economy. It's not going to happen by just throwing money at all of us. Nice for us to have that, but the debt is something that will not be dispensed with easily unless we get really significant economic growth. I get that the Prime Minister and the Treasurer want to try and stave off, a depression even, a recession certainly, but a depression even by doing this. That's fine, but there are so much more that needs to be done to actually get business going. And we haven't talked about China, for example. That's one of my biggest concerns these days. Strategically, we've really cheesed off our largest trading partner. And if they continue with the way they're going, where they don't buy our products, our produce, in the way that they have for the last 30 years, we're in serious strife. And you just can't wave a magic wand and find new markets.
Another classic reason why more needs to be done to make Australian businesses more productive. Not just hire people, but become more productive. I'll get you to stay right where you are if you can, Campbell.